That the British authorities, acting on behalf of British merchants and on the behalf of British missionaries likewise, deployed force against the Chinese state. And they deployed force, after all, in a series of military actions, none of them very, very specific, none of them very large. A series of shellings, for example, by British gunboats of the ports along the China coast, a series of landings from time to time of British sailors and British troops at various of the port cities, a series of military actions that we call collectively the First Opium War, between 1840 and 1842. And we know pretty concretely why it is that British authorities chose to challenge the Chinese state that way. Very concretely, of course, they were riposting to that effort on the part of Chinese authorities, especially Commissioner Lin, to impose a real ban upon the opium trade. In other words, to make opium a real contraband and to forbid it into the China market. But in a very much more general way, what the British were concerned about, of course, was to widen the entire terms of trade with China, to draw China, if you please, into the international circuit of trade. In other words, to make the conditions of trade much more favorable for Westerners and to extend the amount of trading that actually could be done within the framework of this great Chinese mainland. Now, essentially, the Chinese state responded to this First Opium War with a very desultory defense. It is true that in the south of China, in those provinces to the south of the Yangtze River, you do get the Chinese gentry, those who are really the old Confucian ruling class. You do get them organizing militias in these various provinces in order to try to mount a resistance. But in the Chinese court itself at Peking, there was no such great interest in making a very sustained attack against the British, and that for two very good reasons. In the first place, that the conciliators, rather than the intransigent bureaucrats, were in control in Peking. In other words, the ones that thought that the Chinese state couldn't possibly contend with the superior military technology of the West. And in the second place, because there was a very deep sensitivity in Peking to the idea that the Manchu government was already under attack, that it already was very weak, and that should it engage in a long war, it surely would undermine its own staying power within terms of the interior crisis that had been developing within China. The result is that the Chinese state capitulated and made, in 1842, with the British government, the Treaty of Nanking. And the Treaty of Nanking is terribly important. It is important because, after all, it establishes the Western presence in China. It is the treaty, after all, which defines that the West shall reside in China and shall have an economic presence there. But important in two other ways that you must underscore and remember. Important because the Treaty of Nanking is an imposed treaty. In other words, it is imposed by force, and that will always be the methodology by which the presence of the West will be defined and in fact expanded. And all other times, when those treaties are to be changed, and when the terms are to be made more favorable, it will be done under the iron fist of force. And in the second place, because that Treaty of Nanking is only one link in a chain, it is a link in a chain that we call the treaty system. Because almost immediately after the British got their treaty in 1842, the United States got the Treaty of Whampoa, and the French got the Treaty of Wangjia in 1844. In other words, you get a kind of interlocking system of treaties in which all of the commercial powers of the West now get the same privileges and rights that the British derived out of their Treaty of Nanking. And that for a very good reason, because in all of these treaties is inscribed what we call the most favored nation treatment, a clause in all of these treaties that say that every commercial power of the West, which is trading in China, shall trade there on the basis of the most favored conditions that are extended to any other trading power, so that what one country gets, all of them get, by this principle of the most favored treatment, of the most favored nation treatment. Now, essentially, the British got some things especially for themselves in the Treaty of Nanking, because they had been the belligerent power. And so the British annexed Hong Kong, the island of Hong Kong, in the Canton River, at the mouth of Canton, and in the second place got a $21 million indemnity for losses that they had presumably made or suffered in this First Opium War. For the rest, the terms of the Treaty of Nanking are the same ones that you find in the entire treaty system. And I want you to remember them because they tell you something about what the imperialist nexus is, as it is established here in the middle of the 19th century. You get in the first place what are called treaty ports. In other words, whereas Canton had been the one port that had been open to Western trade, now by this treaty system of the 1840s, 5 ports are open. It is Canton, it is Amoy, it is Fuzhou, it is Ningpo, and finally it is Shanghai at the very mouth of the Yangtze River, which will mean that you will be able to penetrate into those central provinces of China. And consequently, there are now 5 ports in which British and foreign merchants can trade freely, can reside, and in which the Western powers will have consular representation. In the second place, what we have called the cont'd, in other words, the monopoly of Chinese merchants, which handle the trade exclusively in Canton, and which have set such very unfavorable conditions, setting the terms of how much would be traded, what prices would be paid. The cont'd is abolished, and now the foreigners are to trade openly with any Chinese merchants who wish to trade. In the third place, and note it well, you get in this treaty system what is called treaty tariff, which means that the West imposes the terms of the tariff. It takes from China away the sovereign right to impose her own tariff, and says in this treaty system that tariff on Western goods will now be 5% of the lira. In other words, just a 5% addition to the value of this goods, which is virtually no tariff at all. And I want you to think of what that means in terms of competition with Chinese artisan goods. That Western goods will now flood in and consequently undermine those traditional artisan industries of China. In the fourth place, there is the principle of what is called extraterritoriality. And the principle of extraterritoriality, a terrible blow at the very concept of sovereignty, because the Westerners always complained that they did not want to be tried in China should they have any litigations with Chinese under Chinese law. They said that Chinese law was inexplicable, that it was not codified, that it used torture by way of punishment, and they wanted then, if they had any litigation, to be tried under their own law. What extraterritoriality says is that in the treaty ports, where the West had their concessions or their living quarters, that they will establish courts in which their residents or nationals will be able to be tried under their law, something unheard of from the point of view of the sovereignty of any other power. And not only that, but extraterritoriality also meant that within those concessions, the Westerners would have the right to establish their own schools, foreign language schools, which meant that the missionaries, of course, would get in, and it meant in the second place that they were able to buy real estate or real property, which they did in large quantities in these treaty ports. And the fifth point of this treaty system is that the Western powers shall have the right to station gunboats in the ports of these particular open cities, and that they shall be able to deploy force whenever their trading interests are threatened. Now, all of that is quite a system to impose on the great sovereign country of China in the 1840s. And I want you to remember that there are certain spin-offs to this system. That is, it isn't just these terms, but think of the spin-off. Think of the fact, in the first place, that the Western powers get in all of the coastal cities that are decreed to be open cities for trade, they get what are called the concessions. And the concessions are residential areas, the famous foreign concessions. And in those concessions, in an ad hoc, empirical way, they begin really to become Western enclaves. In other words, they have their own institution, their own law, they govern themselves. Now, in part, that came in the 1850s because interior-wise, China was upset by tremendous popular uprising, and consequently Chinese administration broke down, so that in the city of Shanghai, for example, you get in September of 1853 the uprising of a secret society called the Society of the Small Knife, and that Society of the Small Knife took over the city of Shanghai. It was a very traditional secret society that wanted to overthrow the Manchu and bring back the Ming. But the result was that the Chinese viceroy in the city of Shanghai had to flee, and in the British concession, the British simply took over the functions of administration. And then in 1854, when the viceroy came back to Shanghai,
the British forced the Chinese to sign an agreement that provided that in their concession, they would have their own elected municipal council, elected by the British residents there, and they would maintain their own police, and they would maintain their own voluntary army, and they would collect their own taxes, and then every other foreign power got that in every other open city. What you are talking about is creating really Western islands within the eastern coastal zones of China already by the 1850s. Consider a second spin-off, and that is what we call Western control over customs. And again, in the 1850s, the customs service broke down because of internal disruption. And so the West began to collect its own 5% ad valorem on its goods and turn it over to the Chinese until, in 1854, they got the agreement from the Chinese government that the whole damn customs service would be in the hands of Westerners. Incredible. Incredible. That the West is collecting its own customs that it is paying and presumably turning them over to the Chinese. Or consider a third spin-off, a little bit more difficult to explain, something that I call the creation of the exogenous zones in China, or for want of a better term, the creation of a kind of imperialistic city. It's hard to explain. What we're talking about is that the cities of the coast, the open cities, not only in the concession area, but as cities, cease really to be Chinese. They aren't Western either. They're bastard cities. They're imperialistic cities. They're cities in which the Western tradesmen are really the powerhouses, the wealthy people. In the city of Shanghai, which now replaced Canton as the major trading city of China for the West, in Shanghai, in those international concessions, you get those great companies like Denton Company, or Jardine and Matheson, or Russell and Company, and their heads are absolute powerhouses. They have the wealth. They come almost to control the city. Or consider the fact that you get a breakdown of all traditional Chinese institutional patterns, a fever of land speculation in the city of Shanghai. An acre of urban real estate in Shanghai cost 50 pounds in 1852. It cost 10,000 pounds in 1862. And you can imagine the kind of British that are really getting wealthy. And along with that whole buffer area of what we call the comprador bourgeoisie. In other words, those Chinese who are the clients, who are the hangers-on of the Westerners, who are the business agents for their commercial houses, or their contraband agents, or their middlemen, or their coolies, or their boys, as they call them. And consequently, a whole range of Chinese that no longer have loyalty to anything but the opportunism of getting on within the framework of Western trade. You know, as I have traveled around the world, I've seen those kinds of imperialistic cities, and it really is something. Because you see, it's that non-language, it's that non-culture. You scratch people, whether they're from the West or whether they're from the East, and you can't tell what they are. You can't anymore find what the original stock was. It's all bastardized. It's like one great, huge America. It all has no substance to it from that point of view. Everything is disconnected. I remember when I was in the city of Bangkok, and Bangkok, after all, should be essentially not only a Thai city, but a Chinese city in a very level. And you walk out and you see those damnable American shopping centers, and you see those supermarkets. And I walked out the first day I was in Bangkok, and I was staying in a hotel called the Rama Hotel. So I walked outside, and immediately I saw a neon sign across the street. In the center of Thai culture, I see a neon sign saying, the Tip Top Club. And so I went across it, I went into it to see. And on the jukebox were all of these horrible American pop songs, all with Thai words. And consequently, people sitting around in a perfectly degenerate American style. And so I finally pulled out a newspaper. It was an English language newspaper. Began to read, just in a sense, to calm my mind. Somebody came over to me, seeing me read an American newspaper. It was the international edition of the Herald Tribune, which follows you everywhere around the world. And consequently, I was sitting there reading this, and this Thai man came up to me and said in this kind of pidgin English, he said, "Are you happy?" What do you have in mind?
What you need to make you happy? And I said, probably more than you can ever offer. He pulled out a little card, you see, because there had been so many Americans there, and he left it with me. On one side was a telephone number that I could call. On the other side was really what is the paradigm of these bastardized cultures, was simply a little sign or a little legend that said, we can get you anything. And he called his telephone number. I saved it, incidentally, just in case I come to the point of externity. But it suffices to say that you get that there, you get it in Taipei, where you find, for example, that Chinese culture superimposed upon Formosan or upon Taiwanese culture really begins to disappear completely under the aegis of the American flag. You find this kind of thing. Well, Shanghai really is the first paradigm of that, is the first place in which you get that very classic kind of exogenous zone, of a zone that really doesn't belong anywhere and that begins to undermine what is the essential base or the essential stock of any civilization or any culture. All of that coming out of the first treaty system. Well, how did it work? Economically, of course, there were gains for the West. That is, the trade in the open ports and in the hinterland of the open ports increased. And then you get that coastal trade, as it's called. And that, especially in the hands of Great Britain, using those steamships in order to go up and down the coast of China to put out of commission, as it were, the boatmen in the interior river trade inside China, because this exterior steam trade was a very much more efficient thing. You get a very flourishing opium trade, because even though opium isn't legalized until 1860 by the Treaty of Peking, nonetheless no Chinese official is going to stop this contraband trade at this point. And finally, you get a very flourishing trade in coolies, one of the least enlightening parts of the whole story. The coolie, of course, the exploited unskilled worker, the displaced peasant in China, or the lumpen proletariat worker, and gathered together in the city of Amoy or the city of Macau, either gathered by force or by seduction, and consequently sent off to work on the plantations of Cuba or Peru or Australia. A terrible, terrible part of the whole thing. The people that gathered the coolies together got wealthy, and the people who shipped them got wealthy, and the people who exploited them as slaves on the plantation got wealthy, and the Chinese died like flies until that time in 1860, when finally the British had to make an agreement with the Chinese government that they would contract coolie labor only for a 5-year period, and then under certain conditions or certain terms, and yet the Westerners were not satisfied with that. And what they missed out of that first treaty system was, first of all, the extent of trade. They still couldn't get deep into that big, vast interior of China. And consequently, those Manchester textiles, lowered in price, going around the Suez Canal now, and consequently shortening the distance, those Manchester textiles still could not displace those interior Chinese textiles, those artisan crafts, unless they could get other treaty ports on the interior of the Chinese rivers. And in the second place, the Westerners wanted diplomatic recognition in Peking. They were sick and tired of having to deal with high and arrogant mandarins in the port cities. They wanted legations in Peking. They wanted to be able to change the terms of their treaties whenever they chose. And so the British and the French together made a démarche in 1854, and they asked Peking for the right to revise the treaties, and they were turned down, because at this point the intransigents are once again the majority in the Chinese court. And they turned down the West, but it's hopeless. In the first place, because at Peking in the court, there is no coherent strategy of how you deal with the West. In the second place, because by the 1850s, China is torn by internal revolution and internal rebellion. And in the third place, because everybody is panicked that a war with the West will mean an end of the regime. And so all that the Western powers need is a pretext for making the Second Opium War, the war between 1857 and 1860, a pretext, plenty of pretext. In 1856, there was a French priest, Père Chapdelaine, who was killed because he happened to be wandering around in the interior provinces where he didn't belong. Well, one dead missionary, that's worth at least 2 provinces in China. And consequently, the death of Père Chapdelaine, that was one of the causes for bombing
Canton or shelling Canton in 1857, then occupying that city in 1858, forcing the so-called Treaty of Tientsin up on the Yellow River in 1858. But you see, what these Western powers wanted was Peking. They wanted to go to that capital, to humiliate that capital, and to show the Chinese that they had to insert China into their own economic scheme. And so the expedition went to Peking. And it went in 1859 and 1860. The Western Expeditionary Force got there in the spring of 1860. They saw that beautiful, lovely summer palace that the Chinese emperors had used. They sacked and pillaged that palace and then burned it to the ground, leaving Victor Hugo to say in a celebrated line that two bandits, France and Great Britain, have arrived in the cathedral of Asia and desecrated it, but that was muscle. And they got their treaty. And who could resist? And in Peking, in the court, the idea on the part of the mandarins was, well, you can't fight the West. They have superior technology. And secondly, there is this interior revolution, and perhaps the West will help a restored imperial regime to suppress its internal revolution. And so the second treaty system, what we call on the Yellow River, so that now the Westerners could get into the interior, into the very bowels of China. In the second place, the opium trade legalized. In the third place, all internal tariffs on Western goods to be suppressed. In the fourth place, that there was to be permanent legation in Peking. The ambassadors would be there and put their pressure. Oh, great. And the Russians moved at the same time. The Russians moved in their own way. And don't think the Chinese don't remember. And the Russians moved while all of this trading imperialism was going on. And you know about Russian imperialism. It's big, landed, atavistic imperialism. And it moves like a kind of a glacier. And consequently, what happens is that in that northeastern part of China, in the area to the north of the Amur River, and in the area east of the Ussuri River, the Russians begin to occupy vast zones of Chinese territory. And so they make what they call the Amur region out of the territory north of the Amur River, and they make the so-called maritime province or coastal province out of the area east of the Ussuri River, and they found a city there of Vladivostok, and all of these great takings are then crystallized and recognized by the Chinese in the Sino-Russian Treaty of November of 1860. What does it all mean? Oh, humiliation, an attack on sovereignty, the presence of the West. Can China last, or will it go the way of colony? But more than that, something that we have already noted, and here it gets explosive. And what we have said is that this impact of the West is conjunctural, that it comes at a very time when there is an interior crisis and the two of them begin to fuse, and there is terrific explosion. Look, that in the 1850s and 60s, China is in immense interior revolution. That in the year 1860, every single one of the 18 provinces of China had some kind of a rebellion or some kind of a revolution. Most of those came out of the secret societies or out of peasant jacquerie and were very traditional. It was the idea of improving conditions, of giving back to some kind of a traditional norm. In other words, they were revolt inside the structure of the old regime. But look, you also get the Taiping Rebellion. That Taiping Rebellion, which ultimately will be the greatest of these internal revolutionary movements. And there you get something that is socially and politically different. You get the crystallization of a new state, a state with a capital at Nanking, called the Taiping Tianquan, the heavenly kingdom of eternal peace. And you are talking about breaking the framework of traditional Chinese society and establishing something else, and you begin to see the very shadowy links with the Chinese communist movement. And the context for these uprisings shouldn't surprise us. It is that the mandate is ruptured. The mandate of heaven no longer is being fulfilled by the Manchu government.
And so you get a deterioration of the public services. Look, that in the year 1852 and 3, the dikes along the Yellow River, right at the frontier of Shandong province, burst and literally inundated a vast zone of the Shandong province, simply impoverishing or starving out all of those Chinese peasants. Look at the fact that the granaries are no longer full, that in the years of the late 1840s and early 50s, there is starvation in China, and these emergency storehouses have no grain. But consider most of all what the Chinese people see vis-a-vis the relationship of their state to the outside. What they see is humiliation. What they see is that their mandarins, their army, no longer can contain the West, and especially in the south of China, in the area south of the Yangtze River, in that territory where there had been the establishment of some popular militia, where there had been a resistance, where the hostility to the Manchus was greatest, you get a proverb circulating around and noted well, a proverb of the 1850s vis-a-vis China and the West that reads, the people are afraid of the mandarins are afraid of the foreign devils, but the foreign devils are afraid of the people. Which means that ultimately it will be a popular movement. It must be a popular movement that will deal with this imperialism. And it is in the South that there is the root of this rebellion, and the greatest form of it, the Taiping Rebellion. And I must talk to you about that, because that Taiping Rebellion plays into a lot of the thinking and even a lot of the strategy that comes much later in the Chinese Communist movement, as we will see. And that Taiping Rebellion grows in the southwest of China. It grows in the extreme southwest, in the province of Tongzhi. And that is a very poor, very backward agricultural province. And it is a rebellion that ultimately will consume millions of Chinese between the period 1850 and 1864. And it's extremely interesting. Tongzhi is the hinterland of Canton. It is a southwestern province, very poor, very rural, but still somewhat within the zone of the city of Canton. And note that well, because you have then two forces at work. You have, first of all, the tremendous economic and social plight of a peasantry that has those traditional utopian dreamlike memories of a time when there was rural equality. Now this is a crucial point, because scholars like Chenot, my good friend Chenot, and scholars like Joseph Needham, in that great work on science and civilization in ancient China, all of them have underscored the fact that before there is the real organization and crystallization in China of this hierarchical, organic society, that there is at least the evidence or the dream of an egalitarian society. And that if Confucianism crystallizes and rationalizes something that is unequal and hierarchical, that there always is a sort of countercurrent that gets crystallized in antiquity in the thought of the Taoists. And here is Needham, for example, telling us how the Taoists pull together in their poems and in their writings so much of this early peasant thinking or early peasant institutionalization, this oral tradition of a primitive collectivism. And so you get, for example, in the Tzu, which dates out of the 4th century BC, this text, listen to it well. Anciently, the people had a constant nature. They wove themselves clothes and tilled the ground for food. This was what we call the virtue of the common life. In the age of perfect virtue, men lived in common with birds and beasts and formed one family with all creatures. How could they know of such distinctions as princes and villains? All living without knowledge, they kept their natural virtue. This was what we call the state of pure simplicity. In that state, the people retained their constant nature. But when the sagely men appeared, cringing and fawning in the imposition of the benevolence, jostling and tiptoeing in the enforcing of righteousness, then men began everywhere to be suspicious. With extravagant orchestras and gesticulating ceremonies, men and women began to be separated from one another. Or in that famous chapter 14 of the Tao Te Ching, which is the great Taoist poem, governing the country, the Confucians say, needs rectification. Command of soldiers in the field, they say, requires strategy. But the appearance of
1945. How do we know that this is so? By looking at the facts. Now listen to this and see if this could be packed up on your wall. The more taboos there are, the poorer the people will be. The more contrivances for private profit there are, the more benighted the whole land will grow. The more cunning the craftsmen there are, the more monstrous their inventions will be. The more laws are promulgated, the more bandits will abound. Therefore, the sages have said, if we do nothing for private ends and contrary to nature, the people will be spontaneously transformed. If we love calmness of mind, the people will set themselves in order. If we take no action for private egoistic ends, the people will grow prosperous. If we have no personal ambitions, the people will spontaneously achieve cooperative simplicity. Well, all that's pretty utopian, but the point is that it's circulated around in the villages. And when you get a lot of these Chinese peasant uprisings, as you get in Tongzhi, for example, in this period of the 19th century, you get all of these old traditions of an egalitarianism. It becomes, in that sense, very socially radical. But that province, you see, I say is also within the ambit of Canton. And in Canton, you see the influence of the West. And consequently, you see the power of the steamship. You see the power of invention. And consequently, you want to know what the secret of that power is. And the whole Taiping Rebellion, originating here in Guangxi, is a fusion of the archaic and the modern, a fusion of that kind of primitive peasant simplicity and that desire to know what it is that makes the West here invincible. And you get that combination or that fusion in the founder of this Taiping Rebellion, the one who became the celestial king, someone called Tongzhi Restoration. Tongzhi, who really is, within the framework of Chinese social history, certainly a power from the point of view of what he was able to organize, is a simple school teacher in Guangxi, and comes a very poor peasant family. But don't think he's a primitive or simple. He's a terribly complex, tense, neurotic guy. And he goes off, after all, to Canton. And in Canton, he sees all of these strange Western inventions, and he's intrigued by it. What the Chinese call the young Wu. In other words, that fascination with what is Western and what is the secret of that power. And then Hung gets involved with certain Protestant missionaries whom he finds in Canton, and they give him a Bible, not even knowing what some very complex, strange, neurotic Guangxi school teacher may find in that Bible. And consequently, he begins to read it, and then he finds an explanation, if you please, for some of the reveries, some of the dreams, some of the kinds of imaginings he has, and you know what he finds, that he has the mission. Because it can be even a yellow man, that he has the mission to liberate his people. And he goes back to Guangxi and he begins to organize among his people. And the first disciples, only 6 of them, 5 of them are absolutely poverty-stricken. A coal miner, a butcher worker, a woodcutter, 2 canal workers who have been unemployed, and one gentry who really wants to fight against the Manchus. And always, you see, within the framework of the Taiping movement, there will be a mass base. In other words, a base of the really déclassés, of the ones that are totally alienated from any proper economic role, but also some of those who are of the ruling class and who want to use this movement in order to fight against this central government. By 1845, the movement has grown, and they formed a society called the Society of the Adoration of God, or the Society of the Worshippers of God. And this begins to get certain thousands until finally, by 1850, when it reaches in Guangxi to the tune of hundreds of thousands of disciples, they found what they call the Taiping Rebellion, which is the heavenly kingdom of eternal peace. By April of 1852, they have formed an army. And those Taiping armies penetrate the frontier of Guangxi and begin to flow north like some kind of terrific wave. And by March of 1853, they have reached the city of Nanking, and it is in that city of Nanking that they establish once and for all their capital, the capital of another dynasty, of another state. Wow, it's way beyond those traditional ruptures of the mandate. Because you see, in the Taiping there is a combination of 3 forces. a combination of social revolution of really a traditional peasant variety. Wherever the Taiping armies moved, they got peasant support, and for good reason, because they took unscrupulous landlords, they took usurers, and they hung them. And consequently, they gave land away to the poor peasants or to the landless, and also they distributed whatever goods they had, and they never took from the poor. And in addition to that, they went into the administrative centers, the so-called yamen, and they burned the tax records. And so the peasantry didn't have to pay the land tax. And so the peasants supported them and liked them. And there was also the National Revolution. And the National Revolution is what attracted to the Taiping Rebellion some members of the ruling class, those that really wanted to oust the Manchus and restore a proper kind of mandate. And that is important, because if you are going to rule over as vast a territory as the Taiping state did, then you must have people with some education also, who can administer, who can, like the merchants did, manufacture the cannon for the armies of the Taiping, and consequently that national theme is important, but also modernism. Also modernism. And note it well, because you cannot enclose China anymore in traditionalism. And in the Taiping, what differentiates it is an appreciation for modernism. In 1859, it is a cousin of Hong Xiuquan who becomes the prime minister. His name is Hong Renjian, and he makes a certain number of proposals. And note this well. 1859, the prime minister of the Taiping state. And he's talking about updating education, of making it much more Western, of getting certain inventions that can strengthen the Chinese state. And so he says in these proposals of 1859, the promotion of facilities of communication is aimed at convenience and speed. If someone can make a locomotive, such as those made in foreign countries, which are capable of 7,000 or 8,000 li in a day and a night, let him be permitted to make that locomotive. The promotion of ships, which should be solid, nimble, and fast. Whether fire, steam, human energy, or wind is to be used for power should be decided by the inventor. At present, there is a steamship which can run more than 2,000 li within a day and night, and which a great merchant can use to transport passengers. This is magnificent, you see. You begin to get these Chinese revolutionaries, basically, seeing that the technology is crucially important, that even if it creates new social forces or new social relations, it will break through the stagnation of Chinese society. The promotion of banks. If a rich man wants to open a bank, he shall first report and deposit his deeds, etc. The promotion of patents for inventing utensils and for various arts. The promotion of hidden treasures. If there are people who discover gold, silver, copper, iron, tin, coal, salt, amber, oyster, shells, jade, precious stones, and other materials, they shall be required to report this to the government, and it shall be exploited and worked. The promotion of a postal service to transmit state documents, post offices to circulate all kinds of private letters. It ends with demands for schools, with demands for hospitals. You see, there is another dimension to this Taiping Rebellion. Now, between the utopian and the reality, there is a gap. You must remember that all through the existence of the Taiping Tianquo, of the heavenly kingdom of eternal peace, the government of that revolutionary state was at war. You must understand in the second place that there never even were fixed frontiers or fixed boundaries to what was Taiping territory. It changed all the time. So that some of the regulations, some of the communal rules that were put on the books never were activated. In 1853, you got an agrarian law, a magnificent agrarian law, which is a sort of a model of a new kind of Chinese collectivism, which says that all the land belongs to the community and shall be redivided according to the number in each Chinese family for the use of the Chinese peasantry. They shall use as much as they need for their own subsistence and give all surplus into the state granaries, into the state warehouses for redistribution. That the Chinese artisans, by another proclamation of 1853, shall be organized into what were called heavenly brigades, and that they shall manufacture their artisan goods and give those goods again into state warehouses where they shall be distributed to each according to his need, if you please. The design for government, very simple. There should be one administrator for every certain number of Chinese families, that administrator to be elected in some kind of a hierarchy going up to the celestial king. But look, you never could put that into effect. You couldn't put that into effect in the 1850s and 60s because this is war, it is civil war. What you can say, the best you can say about the Taiping Rebellion, is that it showed a tendency or a trend. It showed a trend toward great sympathy for the suffering of the Chinese masses, that their burdens, the burdens imposed by the state and the landlords, were lightened, that very frequently they were not required to pay state taxes in the areas that the Taipings controlled. All of that you can say, but you couldn't really make this heavenly kingdom at that time. And then it collapsed. And the collapse is terribly interesting to us. It collapses totally by 1864. And the reasons you must try to understand. That first of all, there is internal dissension in the leadership of the Taiping government. That develops. Tongzhi really had exhausted his resources. He became a bit of a megalomaniac. By the end of the 1850s, he began to distrust people. He created so many wrongs, as they were called, or kingships, in which there were administrators appointed by himself who became sort of vested interests, kind of like what later would be called warlords. In the second place, you get no coordination between the Taiping Rebellion and all of these other rebellions going on in China. And you get no coordination because there's no common denominator. Because most of these rebellions of secret societies really come out of very simple, archaic notions and have no notion of creating a wholly new kind of dynasty. But two factors are crucial. One is that the Manchu state benefits from the reconciliation with the Chinese gentry. That is crucial to understanding the rest of the 19th century in Chinese history. That there is a reconciliation between what is called the central Chinese gentry and the Manchu state. They had hated each other. The Chinese gentry thought the Manchus were corrupt and foreigners, but in the face of a potential social revolution, they did organize their armies in the provinces of China. They did organize their militia. They came to the support of the Manchu state and ultimately penetrated that Manchu state and became responsible for what is called the Tongzhi, or the Restoration, of the 1860s and 70s, as we will see. But a second fact, and that is that the Manchu state, and note it well, could count on the support of the Westerners. The Westerners, for a little while in this civil war, thought that maybe they could deal with the Taiping. Maybe they could deal with this revolutionary movement. Maybe their terms of trade would get better. But you see, all of that changed after the Tianjin-Peking treaties of 1858-60. Because by then, the Westerners got magnificent terms from a weak Chinese government. And that's what they wanted. All of the choices that the West makes, the British, the Americans, the French, especially the Americans, all of the choices they make in the 20th century, Yuan Shikai over Sun Yat-sen in 1912, Chiang Kai-shek over the Chinese communists, all of them are rooted and anchored in this one perception that you can get more by a weak national government in China than by an integral national government, which after all may ultimately change the terms of your presence and even ultimately boot you out. How much the West helped is subject to a certain kind of debate. Because if you look at it statistically, the West gave very little by way of loans, let us say, to the Manchu government in the period between 1853 and 73. There were 21 short-term loans in that period that came to about 7 million tael, but it took 300 million tael really to fight that war against the Taiping Rebellion and to suppress that internal subversion. So there isn't much by way of these loans. In the second place, arms, yes. The West did give certain arms to the Manchu army, but not very many. As far as actual military participation, about 5,000 Western soldiers fought with the imperial armies, with the Manchu armies. The most important part, of course, it's a fascinating sub-chapter of this whole history, the most important part being the so-called ever-victorious army, which was formed by an American freebooter. You see, those were the days when there really were opportunities. And consequently, it is Frederick Ward,
from Salem, Massachusetts, good witch that he was, who came to China and organized a group of adventurers and made this so-called ever-victorious army, which helped to defend Shanghai against the Taiping armies. The point is that quantitatively it isn't very much. The importance of the Western help in suppressing the internal revolution in China is that there is enough of it to come at crucial moments to make some difference. There were times when the money, times when the modern weaponry helped. But beyond that, there is something psychological, that every time the West helped, there was the idea that the power of the West was behind the Manchu government. And that especially imposing when you get weapons, like the kinds of weapons the West was using. Really good guns, let us say, as against the sticks and the noisemakers and the knives that the Chinese are using, and consequently a certain power of mystique begins to attend to the Manchu force. And so you defeat the revolution. And you ask the fundamental question. And it is the question you ask about your own society. It is the question you ask about what happens if there are deep contradictions in a society, if it is in rebellion. How does a ruling class, how does a state cope with those contradictions and with that rebellion? And in China, on that answer hinges everything. Because there is, in the period between 1862 and 74, what is known as the Tongzhi, which is the Restoration. And the Tongzhi is named after the new Chinese emperor, a little boy of 5 who ascends to the throne in 1862. And his name is Tongzhi, and that whole period of the Restoration is given that particular name. And what the Restoration means is very concrete in Confucian terminology. In Confucian terminology, you see, there is an eternal recurrence with dynasties. That is, there isn't progress in the Western sense. The notion of history is that dynasties are born, they reach their maturity, then they decline and fall. And what restoration means is something very concrete. It's a moment of respite, a period of respite in that time between maturity and fall, when you, for a moment, really retard the decline, when you make for some kind of restoration of the system or restoration of that particular ruling class. So that what you're talking about is a respite by the old Chinese ruling class, the Manchu government, and the Chinese gentry. Concretely, you see what you get. To put it in non-Confucian terms, concretely, you get the very best example in all of modern Chinese history of very intelligent, very honest, very honorable conservatives trying to solve the contradictions of Chinese society, trying to restore their power without having to go beyond the framework of a traditional Chinese society and economy. It was futile in the period of the 1860s and 70s. You can imagine what it is when Chiang Kai-shek tries it in the 20th century. Then it is opera bouffe. Then it really is absurdity sublime. And consequently, you have in the Tongzhi an important example. Basically what it is the reintegration into the Chinese state of this Chinese gentry. No longer do the Manchu officials dominate. These very good, strong Confucian scholars, these men of integrity, these men who want to save a traditional China, they now go into the central administration and they dominate the provincial administration of China. There are people like Zheng Fan, for example, who really was the organizer of victory over the Taiping. They're just very tough Confucian scholars. And what they do is to try to restore China on its traditional basis by improving every service within the framework or the context of that society. Look, their ideology is an agrarian ideology. After they suppress the rebellion, after they bring internal order, their idea is to restore a prosperous agricultural society, to stress frugality, that frugality which will make that agricultural society work, given the vast population of China, to stress honesty, so that the administrators, the mandarins, the local officials will keep the canals and keep the dikes up, to stress, if you please, a certain amount of even enlightenment, to bring new lands into cultivation, to bring certain kinds of tax relief to the peasantry, to do anything, if you please, to keep that agrarian economy
functioning, and to prevent a mercantile, industrial economy from penetrating China, which releases new technology, but also releases new social relationships that will upset this social order. That is what the Tongzhi is about. And within its framework, it was a success. Agriculture was restored. But you see, the whole success is a success of the Chinese ruling class. That gentry gets larger, from 1 million to 1.5 million. It agglomerates more land. It keeps the merchants out of key positions. It buttresses its own power. But I tell you that it cannot solve the Chinese problem. They are honest. They are integral. Shen Fan, for example, one of the real Confucian scholars of the 19th century, administrator, general, economist, a brilliant character. But you see, the framework is too narrow. You do anything to prevent that hierarchical society from being upset. And so already, by the end of the 1870s, there are floods and famines that cannot be contained. In 1879, in the province of Shanxi, 5 million died of flood and famine in that one province. And so you get that basic contradiction of landlord and peasant deepening, because the Tongzhi can't possibly pose the question of land if that whole regime is, after all, being run by and in the interest of this Chinese gentry landed class. And it's honest, and it restores Confucianism, and you see the whole thing was summed up very well by Li Dashao, one of the founders of the Chinese Communist movement, writing in 1920. Listen to this brilliant text. And he's talking really about the Tongzhi in the 19th century, but he's also talking about Chiang Kai-shek and every effort to contain China. There is what is called the young world. There is the interest in modernization in the Chinese state. You have it in the 1860s in the form of what is called strengthening, which is the position of the Chinese Mandarin scholars of building certain forges, of trying to get a state armaments industry by using some of the techniques of the West. You get it in the 1870s by a certain state subsidy for mining, even for the textile industry, a little bit of that kind of state subsidy. But all during that period of the Tongzhi, if you take the years 1853 down to 1885, the Chinese state is spending no more than 2% of its national budget on state subsidy for industry, compared to the 15% that the Japanese are spending in the Meiji, in that kind of attempt, really, to make a state-subsidized industrial base for this Asiatic society. In the final analysis, it will be the West that will come in and transform the economy of China. In the final analysis, there will be no national bourgeoisie. The state won't permit it to exist. In the final analysis, if you must transform China from outside the traditional structure, there will not be a bourgeois revolution, but something that goes beyond that. You see the whole boomerang of the response to these contradictions and rebellions in the 19th century. The boomerang is that the state could not, within that framework of Confucian traditionalism, release the forces, couldn't afford to release the forces that really would strengthen and modernize China. Somebody else would have to do that. We know who that was.